What we're going to do here is just a basic introduction to clustering. With clustering, you can have multiple nodes accessing a single quorum, or a shared data store, that is. And with clustering, clients will access the cluster by a cluster IP address and cluster name, just like NLB. So first we'll set this up through DNS. So in DNS, for forward lookup zones for westsim.private, you'll notice I have a host record called cluster, mapped to 1.250. So at the command line, if I were to ping cluster, I should get a resolution of the fully qualified domain name to 1.250. At this point, we haven't set up any clustering whatsoever, so there is no computer on the network that has .250 assigned to it. So DNS is set up, and let's go to our computer here and set up clustering. Now, clustering must be set up on a 2003 Enterprise Edition server as a bare minimum. So we'll go to Admin Tools and Cluster Administrator. And it says, what would you like to do? We would like to create a new cluster. Notice other actions are to add nodes to an existing cluster or to connect to an existing cluster. We're going to create a brand new one though, and click OK. And here we get a wizard. Now what's the domain name? Where is this cluster going to exist? It's going to exist in westsim.private. The cluster name is just going to be cluster, just like we set up in DNS. Which computer will be the first node? This is computer 3, which will be our first node of the cluster. Advanced options. So you can do a full configuration, or you can customize your configuration. We'll just go with the typical configuration. The wizard will now go through and analyze this computer to see if it's feasible for installing a cluster and being a node in a cluster. When the wizard is done with its analysis, we can expand the checkboxes here with the plus signs and get more information. So checking for existing cluster, found a cluster name in DNS, for example, with string of 1.250. It connected to computer 3 successfully. The node is feasible to be a node in a cluster, valid operating system. However, we're getting some error messages here. Let's check these out. So it could not locate a shareable quorum resource. So what that means is it couldn't find a SCSI or fiber channel connection to a storage area network or an outside storage device. That's not going to prevent us from setting up a cluster here with one node with the information on the one computer here. Also, it tells us it only found one network adapter card, and for clustering, it's recommended that you have two network adapter cards. One is to avoid the single point of failure, but also one NIC card typically communicates with clients. The second NIC cards in each node is typically there for the cluster nodes to communicate with each other. So for cluster feasibility, overall, we get a warning message here saying that we could not access a quorum resource. So that's the big thing. We can't really set up a true cluster here. We're going to set up a single node cluster. Also, there's a log file for the analysis. You can get more details. We're just going to click next to the wizard here. Now, what's the IP address for the cluster? We specified 1.250. Now, this part of the wizard asks for the cluster service account information. And you would want to keep this information private and secure so that only the proper individuals can manage the cluster. So we're going to go ahead and just put in something generic like administrator and password. Keep in mind you would definitely have something specific here, such as clue admin and a secure password. So we get a proposed cluster configuration, kind of a summary list of everything that's going to be set up, which you can scroll through and take a look. Notice we're ending up with a local quorum for this setup because it could not find a quorum externally. A quorum that would be external would be a majority node set. We're just doing a local quorum, and we'll click Next. Okay, and green is good. Tasks completed. The cluster has been created. You can go through the check marks here to see what was accomplished during the creation of the cluster. So it compared the configurations, validated credentials, found some common resources, configured the services, the cluster service account was created, configured some resources, etc. And again, you can look at the log for even more detail. So we have our cluster. Let's test out accessing our cluster from a client perspective. So if we open up the command prompt, you can choose to ping the cluster by name or IP address. Let's test that out. So the IP address worked. Now we can ping by name to see if name resolution is working. And there we go. So even though there's no actual computer with a .250 address, the logical address of the entire cluster is .250. So when we ping cluster, DNS resolves that to the FQDN and the IP address, and that gets, through the clustering technology, referred over to node 1. So node 1 is the node that's really responding here to our ping request. So in the cluster console, let's take a look at some things we've got here. We've got groups, so we've got one cluster group. We've got resources, a bit on the cluster configuration, resource types, networks available, network interfaces. And then we have the actual node 1 here, active groups, active resources, etc. You can right-click the cluster icon here and choose to create a new node. And that's how you would add a node to the cluster. That node would appear underneath node 1. Now also with clustering, you can define resources. And the resources can be set up on one node, all nodes, and you can set up failover for resources. So it kind of depends what you're trying to accomplish. There's a variety of ways of configuring clustering. But let's just do a simple example here. We're going to create a new resource. By the way, I could have right-clicked anywhere. It didn't have to be on the resources folder. We're going to call this resource the C drive. Notice there's a large number of resource types, so you want to be very careful to specify the correct type for your resource. Let's take a quick look. Notice we're going to do a file share, so we'll skip that for now. You can define an IP address resource, a quorum resource, majority node set resource. Physical disk is a common resource. You can define a physical disk that both nodes of a cluster might share and provide failover for the physical disk. So a variety of things here. We're going to do a file share. And for which group? The cluster group. So possible owners, node 1. When configuring a cluster resource, you can select various possible owners. So if we had more available nodes, we could add them to the possible owners column here. We can also specify dependencies. Does this resource depend upon any other resources? For example, if you define an application resource, that application may depend upon a physical disk resource. If the disk isn't running, then the application's not running. So you can specify a dependency in that fashion, and vice versa. So if the disk fails, the application fails, and you can set it up so if the cluster restarts, that if you've specified dependencies, that the disk restarts first, and then the application is brought up online. So we have no dependencies for this resource. We'll just click Next. And we can configure the share name and path. For share name, we'll say C drive again. And we'll click Finish. So the resource was created successfully. Let's look in our resources area, and there we have our C drive resource. So we're sharing the C hard drive, that is. And we can bring that online. Fantastic. Under Node 1, active resources, we'll see C drive, because it's the only possible owner of that resource. And let's test that out. So from a client perspective, we can access the cluster using a UNC path, just whack cluster. Now again, there's no computer name with the name cluster. So this gets translated through DNS to the cluster IP address, which will get referred over to node 1. And there we go. So we're accessing / cluster, and there we go. C drive. See the comments I made about the C drive? Opening that up. And there literally is our C drive for node 1. So that's just a basic example of creating a resource and choosing a possible owner for that resource.